We are very pleased to have Chitra Divakaruni with us here this morning. I'll let her share the story with you and the inspiration of the book coming from a hurricane, of all things. Chitra is an award-winning author and poet. She's been published in over 50 magazines, including the Atlantic Monthly and the New Yorker. She was born in India and lived there until 1976, when she left Calcutta and came to the United States to continue her education. Chitra currently teaches at the nationally ranked creative writing program at the University of Houston, and is involved with organizations that help South Asian and South Asian American women who find themselves in abusive or domestic violence situations, and is also involved with organizations that help children, especially those living in the urban slums in India. Chitra lives in Houston now with her husband and her 2 sons, whose names have actually appeared in some of her books. Chitra Divakaruni, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you to all the library systems for choosing this book for Gulf Coast Reads, and thank you to all of you for coming here and being with me on this special launch day. So I am just so honored that One Amazing Thing has been chosen for this program, because just as Jennifer said, it truly is a book about how we can create communities, how communities come out of the strangest places and are formed from people that at other times we would only think of as strangers, and maybe not even strangers that we really want to get to know. I'll start by telling you a little bit about this book and how I came to write it. As Tim hinted, it really did come out of a natural disaster. It came out of a hurricane that was coming towards us in 2005. We all remember this hurricane if we were here at that time, Hurricane Rita. And if you remember, the city authorities wanted us to evacuate at that time, and so we all made a valiant effort to do that. And of course, whatever is supposed to happen when a city of this many million people all try to evacuate at once, that's exactly what happened. Our path of evacuation was along I-10, and we started in the evening, and at 2 a.m. in the morning, we were still on I-10. We had only progressed a few miles, and people were getting very anxious, because we had our radios on and Hurricane Rita was coming closer. And if there's anything worse than being in your own home during a hurricane, is being in your car during And so all around me, I could see people were beginning to panic, and people were behaving very badly. And in our own car, we had our own bad behavior going on. But I won't get into that, especially since my wonderful husband was the bad behavior was mostly on my part. It was like, why did you take I-10? We could have gone up to Dallas. By now we would be in Dallas. That of course was not true. People going up to Dallas were having exactly the same problems. Maybe some of you were on that state. And we could share our stories after this. However, what I began to notice is that as people around me were getting really panicky, and by now people had spilled out of their overheated cars, and they were getting into arguments and fist fights, and things were really heating up. And as people were panicking, surprisingly, there were some people, it was like the disaster or the approach of the disaster had brought out the best in them. They were going around trying to calm people, sharing water, helping the elderly. And the writer part of me began to notice this. And I said to myself, how interesting that situations where our lives suddenly appear out of control can bring out the worst in us, and it can bring out the best in us. And I said, well, if Rita decides not to come down this road right now, and if I live to write other stories, then I will write a story about this. I will explore how is it that some of those people were able to create a sense of community in the midst of all of this happening on I-10? How is it that they could create that sense of community? And I wanted to explore that. And Tim was asking me, well, since the hurricane was the inspiration, how come here it becomes an earthquake? Well, that's because I'm a fiction writer. And really, being a fiction writer, I have to take things that occur in my life, and I have to change them. It's really not even a choice. I mean, it is. Fiction writers, I think, are much safer. They're better off than people who write about actual people in their lives. I think those people are very brave. I would never, I'd never be able to do it, and I won't be allowed to do it because I have 2 teenage sons, and they have told me in no uncertain terms that I am never to write about them. They should never appear in any of my books. Okay? However, you know, you get it. All right, so what happens in this book is that it's the middle of the day, and there's 9 people who are in an Indian visa office. So this is taking place in a city here in the United States, and 2 of these people work in the visa office, and 7 of them have come to get visas to go to India. So this is an Indian visa office, and as they are all waiting for their visas, the earthquake strikes. They're in the basement of a high-rise building. It's a major earthquake, and they are in a lot of trouble. Now, just before the earthquake occurred, one of the point of view characters noticed the people around her. So I'll tell you a little bit about the cast of the story. But I also want to go back and tell you a little bit about what I was doing in this book that was different. With each of my books, I try to set myself a challenge, a new kind of challenge. So in this book, because I knew that this was going to be a book about creating community, one of the things I really believe about communities is that when people come together, everyone is important. Everyone is to be respected. Everyone has something to give. And for that to happen in the novel, they all had to be equally important in terms of telling their stories. So this novel is told in the voices of all 9 characters. They get pretty much equal time on the page. And so, you know, that was a big challenge for me. Most novels, as you know, they'll have 1 or 2 protagonists and maybe an antagonist, and then everyone else is minor. But in this book, they're really, all 9 characters are major. Nobody is minor. But one of them, her name is Uma. She's a graduate student of English. And she looks around and she says, wow, look at all these different people. There's an old woman who's Asian. She looks Chinese. She's dressed in her Chinese clothes, and she's accompanied by her granddaughter, who's about 13 years old and who's, you know, who's very punk in her outfit and her makeup and all of that. There's an older Caucasian couple, and they look very affluent, but they don't look very happy. There's a young man, and she looks at him and she says, and he's dressed in a very traditional Muslim manner, and she looks at all these people. There's right next to her, there's an African-American older man. She looks at all these people and she says, what are they all going to do in India? and of course, that is a question that the story raises, in addition to what are they all going to do when they realize that they're not going to India? And the book will answer both questions. But I thought I'll read to you a little bit from When the Earthquake Strikes. A little background. So Uma is here because her parents, after having lived in the US for many years, have moved to India to retire. And that is actually a phenomenon that we're seeing quite a bit of in the South Asian community. That people, you know, as they retire, they feel the pull of the land where they grew up and they're going back. And so Uma's here because she wants to go visit her parents. And she thinks, she suspects, she fears that her parents have like an ulterior motive in having her come to India. However, I won't give that away. You will have to get the book. Anyway, so she's in this building and she has a boyfriend. His name is Ramon. And she hasn't told him that she's here to get a visa. But now, you know, she's been waiting for a long time and she feels, maybe I should call Ramon. And that's the moment from which I'm going to be reading. Oh, and she can't get reception because, of course, she's in the basement. Phone to her ear, Uma took a few steps forward. The phone gave a small burp against her ear, but before she could check if it was working, a rumble rose through the floor. It was as though a giant had placed his mouth against the building's foundation and roared. The floor buckled, throwing Uma to the ground. The giant took the building in both his hands and shook it. A chair flew across the room toward Uma. She raised her left arm to shield herself. The chair crashed into her wrist, and a pain worse than anything she had known surged through her arm. People were screaming. Feet ran by her, then ran back again. She tried to wedge herself beneath one of the chairs, as she had been taught long ago in grade school, but only her head and shoulders would fit. The cell phone was still in her other hand, pressed against her ear. Was that Ramon's voice asking her to leave a message, or was it just her need to hear him? Above her, the ceiling collapsed in an explosion of plaster. Beams broke apart with the sound of gigantic bones snapping. A light fixture shattered. For a moment before the electricity failed, she saw the glowing filaments of the naked bulb. Rubble fell through the blackness, burying her legs. Her arm was on fire. She cradled it against her chest. A useless gesture, when she would probably die in the next minutes. Was that the sound of running water? Was the basement they were in flooding? She thought she heard a beep, the machine ready to record her voice. Ramon, she cried, her mouth full of dust. She thought of his long, meticulous fingers, how they could fix anything she broke. She thought of the small red moles on his chest. She wanted to say something important and consoling, something for him to remember her by. But she could think of nothing. And then her phone went dead. And of course now we're in the midst of this earthquake, which is indeed a major one. No cell phones, no phone lines, no electricity, and no way to get out. The door has been blocked by debris. Throughout this novel, it is my hope that people will begin to ask themselves questions about what might they do if they are in a situation like this. Because it seems to me that in all our lives, pretty much, we're going to be in situations, perhaps not of natural disasters, but where life seems out of control. And Tim and I were talking about how people just hate that. We want to be in control. We like to believe we're in control. We probably believe that much more than it's true. We're probably never in as much control as we think. But certainly when something like this happens, it makes us realize that there's very little we can control, and that is a scary feeling. So one of the things I want people to think at the end of this scene is, if you had only one thing to say to your loved one, what would it be? If you had to make that phone call that Uma was making, would you know what you had to say if you had just one, maybe just a few seconds to say it? Anyway, now the earthquake has struck, people are panicked, and as you saw, they're all people of different ages and backgrounds and religions and races, and they just do not like being stuck there with each other. They don't trust each other, they don't think they have anything in common, they don't agree with each other as to how they should what they should do. Some of them want to break out of that locked door. Some of them realize that that might cause further disintegration in that building. And so they're fighting. They're really getting into some big fights. And after a particularly difficult episode, Uma, the graduate student, says, look, we're just destroying each other. We figured out that we can't get out of here. We figured out we can't reach anyone outside. Now we can just let the panic destroy us, or we can turn our attention to something else. And then she suggests, why don't we each tell a story, something out of our lives that we've never told anyone? Well, immediately everybody thinks this is a terrible idea. We're dying and you want us to think of stories? And then one of them says, I don't even have a story. I don't even have a story to tell that would be of interest. And Uma says, I don't believe that. She says, I believe that in every life there is at least one amazing thing. And that became, of course, the title of the novel. Because that is also my belief, that in all of our lives there are amazing things, at least one, possibly many. And one of the things I hope that this book will do is to make you think about your one amazing thing. And in fact, I do believe on the Gulf Coast Reads website, isn't there a place for people to write in their one amazing things?
Yes, there is.
And I certainly hope that all of you will, and that you'll go and tell your friends about this book and about that opportunity to share your one amazing thing. Because what this group of people begin to discover as they open up and as they begin to share those stories that they've never told anyone is that the sharing of the story helps to make them into a community. The telling and the listening, the connection of the story makes them into people who care about each other. And that is certainly my hope for communities. I think, storytelling, which used to be such a big part of our cultures, is dying out. And we just need more and more of that. So I'm so glad that the storytellers are here today they'll be performing, they'll be teaching workshops, and I hope you will make use of that as well. So I'm going to jump now to one of the stories. This is the story told by the young woman who works in the visa office, Malati. And it's not going to go into why she's here, but it will tell us a little bit about her background. I should give you a little background on Malati also, which is that everybody, in the beginning of the novel, everybody hates her. This is because she sent out these appointment letters for all of these people, like 100 people in the beginning of the novel, and they all said, your appointment is at 9 a.m. So these people have been waiting and waiting and waiting, and they do not feel very happy about her. And my hope is that as they hear her story, their feelings are going to change. The story is in Malati's voice. When I failed 10th grade for the second time, my parents figured it was no use wasting more money on my school fees and decided to marry me off. She comes from a kind of not a small town, but a conservative, middle-sized town. I had no objections. It was not as though I had anything else to do. Having navigated their way through the weddings of 2 daughters already, my parents knew that the local matchmaker would ask for a photograph. If they could provide her with one in which I looked better than normal, my chances of finding a husband and theirs of negotiating a smaller dowry would be highly improved. Though in general thrifty and suspicious, they knew the importance of a well-chosen investment. That is how I ended up at Miss Lola's Lovely Ladies Salon, the premier beauty shop in Coimbatore. My mother had been to Lovely Ladies only twice, but Miss Lola knew her right away. The bridal photo special? Again? She asked. When my mother nodded, Miss Lola looked me up and down and pronounced that I would require more work than my sisters. My mother gave a sigh but did not disagree, and the two of them fell to bargaining about the price of my beautification. When they had reached an agreement, Miss Lola gave a volley of staccato instructions to the pink uniformed girls who worked for her, ending with bridal special, silver level with hair oil. Two girls whisked me to an inner sanctum filled with elegant women undergoing the painful process of improving upon nature. That's something we can relate to in all cultures, yes? I was settled into a reclining chair and shrouded in cotton sheets. And it was here, in this moist, air-conditioned room, decorated totally in shades of pink, Lola's favorite color, and fragrant with astonishing and exotic substances which my naive nose was incapable of identifying, that I saw, as though illuminated by lightning, the path of my future. Okay, so until then, all she thought she can do is she could get married or she could become a school teacher. Now she doesn't want to become a school teacher because, in her own words, teachers were meagerly paid. This is her words, I'm not agreeing with her. Teachers were meagerly paid and resembled chewed up sticks of sugar cane, and I had no desire to become one. But now a new avenue has opened up for her. Lola's girls, though, with their perfectly arched eyebrows, glowing skin, and pretty faces hanging over me like radiant moons, were different. As they plucked and exfoliated and massaged oil and pinched blackheads and slathered my cheeks with fair and lovely cream. Yes, some ladies here recognize this. Clucking soothingly when I yelped and assuring me that the end result would be worth it. I felt a strange kinship with them. They camouflaged me with sufficient foundation, face powder, kohl, lipstick, blush, and Vatica pure coconut hair oil. Yes, to pass as one of Lola's lovely ladies. I have to confess, I have a bottle of Vatica pure coconut hair. They attached a glistening bindi to my forehead and clipped fake diamond earrings to my ears. They pinned a sequined sari, kept in the salon for this very purpose, to my upper body, since that was all the photo would show, to manufacture curves where none had existed before. One of them ran to fetch Lola's nephew, who operated the photography business next door, while the others demonstrated facial expressions guaranteed to delight mothers-in-law, causing me to burst into laughter, something I never did in the presence of strangers. But they were no longer strangers. They had charmed me with their daring jokes, their code words for particular beauty procedures, their gallant laughter in the face of the drudgery that I guessed awaited them once they stepped out of the magical perimeter of Lola's salon. The next morning, when my mother armed me with a parasol to protect my newly lightened skin and dispatched me to the bazaar to buy bitter gourd, I used the money to rent an auto rickshaw. Half an hour later, I was at Lola's, begging her to let me work for her. Lola must have seen something, perhaps a glint of determination in my eyes reminded her of her own younger self. Although she had a room full of clients, she took the time to listen. When I finished, she asked, "What's the matter? You don't want to be a bride?" To which I answered, "I'd rather be a bride maker." Lola, who had been divorced twice and thus knew what was what, said, "Smart thinking." And just like that, though she hadn't really needed another employee, I became one of Lola's girls. Okay, so now her life is totally changed, and she's going to meet the richest and sometimes the most vicious women in the city, because they all come over here. I will read to you a little bit just from one of them who's going to play a big part in Malti's life. Among the cream of Coimbatorian ladies who frequented Lola's, the richest and the most powerful was Mrs. Vani Balan. Wife of an industrialist who had made his money in cement, she visited Lola's every 2 weeks and underwent our most expensive regimes. In spite of the substantial tips she left, the girls avoided her. They didn't like the way she flicked the rupee notes at them. Besides, she was finicky and hot-tempered and had been known to throw things if a treatment did not turn out the way she had envisioned it. Only Lola was capable of handling her at that time, and even she would pour herself a full glass of rum and coke after Mrs. Balan exited the premises. Now, Mrs. Balan, however, takes a strange liking to Malati, and she wants Malati to do all her procedures from then on. So, which is unusual, and Malati is at once flattered and terrified. Just one more paragraph about Mrs. Balan. Mrs. Balan talked incessantly on her cell phone. She had perfected the art of speaking without moving her facial muscles, and could thus continue to destroy reputations from under a substantial swath of seaweed or a coating of alpha hydroxy peel thick enough to render most women immobile. Thanks to her, I became privy to all manner of skeletons lurking in the closets of our fanciest mansions. Were I so inclined, I could have blackmailed large numbers of addicted husbands, unfaithful wives, and grown offspring with questionable sexual preferences. But we at Lola's had our code of honor. Okay. But things are going to get really heated up because now Mrs. Balan's only son, the apple of her eye, is coming back from the United States where he had come to study, and now he's filled with all kinds of newfangled notions of equality, and he's going to fall in love with the most unsuitable young woman. Who is that? No. And that is where I will stop. Did you want questions from the audience?
Yeah, we can do some Q&A.
Okay. Okay. If you want, you may ask some easy questions to which I should be able to provide brilliant answers. Yes, Lois.
You mentioned that each of your books, you've set a challenge for yourself. You told us the challenge for this one. Tell us one other challenge in one of your earlier books that you wanted to meet and maybe feel you did or not quite. That's a very interesting idea.
Thank you. Lois asked, I set myself a challenge in each of my books, so what were maybe one or two other challenges that I set in other books? For my first novel, The Mistress of Spices, which some of you might know and which has been made into a movie, had the particular two challenges. One was it was going to be set, most of it, in one location, which is a spice store. And the Mistress of Spices is the woman who runs the spice store. And her special, it's a magical realist novel, so her special power is that she can look into people as they enter the store, and she can tell what is it that they most need, or what is it that they most desire, which are not always the same thing. And then she had the power of spices. She knows the power of spices, and she would give them spices, sometimes without their knowing, to help them with this. Okay? So my first challenge was to have everything happen in such a small space, right? A little room just about this big, and the whole novel pretty much has to take place in that, because she's not allowed to leave the spice store. So I had to figure out how to embellish that and how to create a sense of the larger world, which I did through flashbacks, through imaginings, and through, again, I guess I've always been interested in stories people would come in and tell her their stories. So we got many different worlds coming into the store. So that was one. And in the novel that was before this, The Palace of Illusions, that novel is based on, or it is a retelling of an ancient Indian epic, the Mahabharata, that many of you may be familiar with. It's a very large epic, and I wanted to retell it from the point of view of one of the major women characters, Draupadi or Panchali. She has several names in the novel. She's called Panchali. So my challenge there was to take that epic world and make it so that it was at once authentic to its original, and it was like relatable, so that people reading it today in our time and this place would be able to feel why that epic still matters, why those themes are still important, why that character is someone they should be able to identify with. So that was my challenge. And I think the way I did it was really by getting into the narrator Panchali's head, into her psyche, and seeing how she would have been growing up. The novel is from the moment of her birth to the moment of her death, so it's a large span as well. And I tried to make her a timeless character, a woman who has many of the concerns that women today would have, but who's also faithful to the original. Did I manage in both of these books? Well, that's for readers to say. This is the time, folks, you can jump up and say, we love those. Yes?
Did you start as a fiction writer?
That's a good question. Did I start as a fiction writer? No, I started as a poet. And also, I didn't start as a writer until much later. When I was growing up, all through my schooling, I didn't think I would become a writer at all. I had no idea of that. And in fact, I think immigration made me into a writer, because it just transformed my world. I found myself in a very different place from where I grew up. And I think I began to write for two reasons: to remember India so that I wouldn't forget it, and to make sense of my new life here. So that's how I started, and I started very hesitantly. I didn't have any formal training in writing. This was after I'd finished all of my formal education. And for many years, I was a closet writer, a closet poet. And then slowly I joined writers' groups, which was very helpful to me. And slowly I started sending things out. And then I found out that I was very interested in telling stories. My poetry became very narrative. All of them were telling stories. And so I figured that I needed to move into a medium where I could tell stories more easily and tell longer stories, trace cause and effect, look at how characters changed, and ultimately really portray a world, which is what I'm trying to do in the novels. Yes, back there.
So you want any Mr. Spice's famous movie, and by the way, back here, I thought it was really good. But are there any of your other novels that you'd like to see on the big screen?
Well, Mistress of Spices has been made into a movie. Sister of My Heart was made into a TV movie in India. It actually became a TV serial and was extremely popular and won 5 awards in that category. I have to segue or kind of veer into a little story which may be of interest. So it's just been made into a movie. It's also just come out in India, Sister of My Heart. So my publisher sends me to India, and I'm going to do, this was made into a movie in South India in Tamil, in one of the South Indian languages. So I'm in Chennai, which is the main city there, and I'm supposed to do a little talk. So I'm like, okay, and the director of the movie, she was like, okay, I'll come by and we'll have a conversation. So I'm waiting outside, and outside the mall where the bookstore is, and there's all kinds of people. I can barely get through. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of people, and I'm like, wow, isn't that nice? And then I realize as soon as she begins speaking, they're like up and they're clapping and they're like so excited. I'm like, oh, they didn't come to see me. Because she was not only a director, but she's also a very famous actress. Her name, and many of you might know, is Suhasini Maniratnam, and she and her husband are a very famous pair. So the path to authorhood is fraught with humility and humiliation. For any authors or authors to be in the audience, I just want to lay it all out. Yes. And then right now several are being optioned, so keep your fingers crossed and we'll see where it goes. By the way, if there are any filmmakers in the audience, we can have a talk.
I have two questions. First thing is, every writer I come across is very Indian writer. They're Bengali, and I think you're Bengali origin, I guess, and they're pretty good writers. And the second question is, when you write about characters, like you supposing choose a character, do you develop it, like how do you go on, like or do you use previous references from what you've written, or is it someone your real life character or somebody described to you, or how do you develop that?
Okay. So your question is, how do I develop character? Do they come out of my real life? Is it things that people have described to me, or what? Well, as I told you before, being a cautious person, I stay away from real life people. Although, I don't know, I mean, you look like a person I could maybe put into So folks, in the later novel, you see a young man who looks like this, maybe you should stand up so they can recognize you later. But generally, I get ideas for stories out of what people often tell me, or I have to confess I'm a great eavesdropper. So I'll go to these parties, and in the Indian community we love having parties, big dinners, and if you are just there and quiet enough, well, you'll get like a bushel full of stories. So anyway, that's how I get a lot of my story ideas, and also by reading. I think I get a lot of ideas through reading. But my characters, no, I just imagine all of them. Because I find that if I get ideas for characters from people, then it's hard for me to move away from that, and then I get stuck in that, and then that's not good for the story. It's much better for me when I can imagine people. Yes, back there.
Where do you find the time? Where do you go to write?
Where do I find the time, and where do I go to write? Time is really difficult because it is a challenge, because I have a family, I have a wonderful family, and I want to say thank you to my husband, who is very supportive. Murthy, thank you so much for all those frozen dinners that you have uncomplainingly eaten, and sometimes even had to fix for yourself. So I have family responsibilities. I teach at the University of Houston, which is, by the way, we have the most wonderful creative writing program. I hope you know about this. There are several university people here. There's a poet in the audience, so you can nab him. There's Kevin, one of our new poet professors. So, and there's Wyman, there's Lois, there are all kinds of wonderful people from the university here. Thank you all for coming. And so it is difficult, and I do some community work. I think one of the things I've had to do is prioritize writing. So sometimes other things won't get done until I've done my writing. I set aside a certain amount of time on days when I'm not going into the university. I set aside maybe 3 to 4 hours. I go to my writing desk just in my study at home, and that's when I write. And I think that is a discipline that I had to learn. Earlier in my life, when I was when I was starting out, I would say, well, I will write when I have inspiration. Well, guess what? Yeah, I didn't get much writing done. So now I'm like, I will go to my desk. And I think Flannery O'Connor has a wonderful quote, which I'm sure I'm misquoting, but basically what she says, from 9 to 12, I'm at my writing desk, and if inspiration arrives, I greet it happily. So, but if it doesn't, I'm there, I'm working. And I think that's what I've just had to learn to do. I think prioritizing, that takes us a long time to say, my writing is more important than all of these other things.
Just a quick follow-up question.
Yes, a
So
follow-up
do you
question.
still use pen to write or computer?
Do I use a pen and paper? I use the computer most of the time, especially when working with fiction, because there's large amounts of material, and just because revision has become so much easier with using the computer. But I do carry a writer's notebook. I have, and whenever I'm traveling, I always write by hand. So if I'm traveling, I'm on the airplane, I'm in various places where I can't get to the computer. I have a writer's notebook. I do recommend that. Having a writer's notebook is really helpful. And it's nice to actually physically write some of the time. Yes?
Yeah, I'm not at all a writer. And I've always wondered, because I'm so impatient, if I wrote something, it'd be like, Joe did this, then he did this, and he did this. And it's like, but the writer just brings whole scenes to life that you can imagine. And I'm wondering, do you start out and sketch out, first you sketch out what you're going to write, so you have kind of an idea, and then maybe you put in a little light layers, and then you add more and more details, or do you just start at the top and fill the whole thing in,
That's a very good question. So when writing, do I write an outline and then fill it in a little and fill it in a little more? Or do I write the whole thing at once? It depends. It depends. I think I'm more towards that second one though. And that's because I do a lot of my pre-writing in my head. So I'm thinking of the ideas and I'm imagining it, I'm picturing it in my head already before I can write it. And in fact, I can see myself sometimes, like I might be cooking, yes, sometimes I do, and I'll be thinking of lines, I'll be saying lines in my head, and that's when I know I'm ready to start because those lines are there already. So I've imagined it, I've understood the scene, I've understood the character, and then I come to write. Otherwise, I know that that first draft won't be very good. So a lot of my writing, and I say this to my students also, and that's probably true of other writers in the audience, a lot of the writing goes on in your head long before it appears in any kind of physical form. Has that been your experience? Yeah? So, so I think if you begin thinking about things, then you're not as impatient because now you've thought it through, and now you want to say it just right. You want to get that vision onto the paper. And I think that helps me. Not that that's the end of the process. That's still pretty early in the process because a lot of revision has to happen as well. I'm an incessant reviser. In fact, I should confess, you didn't know it, but as I think about, even after books are published, sometimes I think of a better way to say them. And as I was reading this, I was creating the new and improved version. The craft of writing, yes, I think you do. Do you have to go through a formal program? Of course, I teach in a formal however, I myself did not go through a formal program, but it took me a lot longer to learn the things that I'm teaching my students. I had to learn by trial and error, but I did have to learn. There is definitely a craft of writing. And it's very complex because unlike in some of the other subjects where there's always one right answer, in writing there are many right ways of doing things and many wrong ways of doing things too. So it's much more complicated, I think, on a certain level. So yes, there's definitely an art. One can learn it oneself by reading the great writers, and they are ultimately, great books are our teachers. But going through a program is very helpful. Not only does someone tell you what works and what doesn't, and really cuts through years of frustration that you might have on your own, but they can also look at your writing and say what's working and what isn't. Because we're so close to our creative work, and this is probably true for writers and other people in different disciplines, that it's very hard for us to tell what works and what isn't working. And then someone like your professor or in workshop, people will give you feedback, and that is extremely helpful for you to learn what kind of writer you are, what's your strength, what's your weakness, where you need to spend more effort, things of that kind.
Is your course online or is it all physical?
Is my course online or is it all physical? It's all physical. It is at our wonderful University of Houston. You may go over there and find out more about it. We have a great graduate program and we have a great undergraduate program for creative writing. Okay, thank you all so much. This has been such a wonderful event to be here with all of you and to talk about my book and to have you spend time. And thanks to everybody, and thanks especially to all of you who laughed at my joke.